Welcome to Redefine the Circle, a podcast where we discuss all things pitching. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development at S2 Breakthrough. In this podcast, we're going to highlight topics that focus on how to maximize your pitchers now. We're going to discuss some of the trends that we've seen at S2 Breakthrough and talk about how we use data to create systems and training approaches that are specific to each pitcher. It's so important for us to continue to share this information and facilitate discussion within the pitching community so we can keep evolving as coaches and ultimately grow pitching into something it's never been before. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for joining the quest to redefine the circle. Hi everyone, welcome back to Redefine the Circle. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development at S2 Breakthrough. We are kicking off episode 3 today, and for those of you who are new to Redefine the Circle or new to this series, absolutely go back and watch episodes 1 and 2. What we're really hammering out in this series is, in series 5, is this concept of symptoms versus roots, particularly as it relates to the pitching motion, the biomechanics, trunk versus levers. We're really talking about what we see in video, what our eyes as coaches really gravitate toward, whether it's stride leg, whether it's glove arm, which are the two topics we've talked about so far, and how we, in the traditional pitching culture, really have spent our time like creating drills and really like fixating on those concepts of like, we have to fix where that glove arm positioning, that arm path. We have to fix the stride leg position or where your foot is landing. These are just a variety of examples where we really get stuck on those things, creating drills around those things. And what this discussion is about in series 5 is this concept of we're missing that the root, that those levers, the positioning of what's going on with things like glove arm positioning or arm path. Today we're going to talk about drag foot, that they are just a result of what's happening with the trunk. And so what we've done in each episode of this series is to really go back into 4D motion sports, look at a quantitative analysis of what's happening with the trunk. What is the actual breakdown that's occurring? And why are these things actually happening? When we want to make change with them, then we have to really understand why they're occurring in the first place. So as I mentioned, today's episode is all about the drag foot, which I think is such an important concept because like forever in the pitching world, we have focused on getting people to drag appropriately. And I think most recently what I've seen a lot of, whether it just be on like, social media or whatever, are people really focused on like dragging the top of the foot where you're just like jumping forward and forcing the foot to drag forward. We've seen like gadgets that force us to do that, to stay on the toe. And really what that's doing is like taking the rotation out of the motion. There's no doubt about it. We want to make sure that when we're in the load phase of the motion, we're putting force in the ground, in the sagittal plane. We're not letting things wiggle side to side. But after we launch off the ground, absolutely the pelvis and then therefore the feet, because of the femurs, should be generating rotation. The motion is rotational. So to the degree that which we just focus on the drag foot as like, this is the problem, and then this is how we're going to fix it, and we're forcing everyone to just like stay forward on their toe, we are driving a whole nother issue, which is really like making the motion anti-rotation. And then that's a whole nother, there are other symptoms essentially that come out of that. So it's so important to understand that. We don't want to just see that something's wrong with the levers and then go and attack it without understanding why it's occurring in the first place. I think it's also just important to know is like, we know that there's a rule, you have to keep your foot dragging on the ground. But basically what that's referring to is like, you can't jump and replan and regain the ground. And so in order for a pitcher to be able to effectively keep her toe dragging on the ground, she has to have a lot of like posterior chain contribution in her motion to the degree that which we're moving forward and the anterior side of the body is really dominating the motion and everything spilling forward, that foot's going to come off the ground. This is why we see like 10-year-olds, 8-year-olds, they don't have posterior chain control. Like this is a ridiculous conversation about, linking those two concepts together. And so they're just going to, if they're being explosive off the ground, if they're really trying to push off of the rubber, they're likely that foot's going to elevate on the backside. And so it's, another topic, but it's related. This concept of like forcing the foot to drag, we don't even really understand what allows it to do that. The fact that we even have rules for our young pitchers, basically what we have to ask our young pitchers to do is not to learn to be fast off the rubber because the degree to which they are learning to be explosive and to really use the ground and move quickly from ground up, they're going to lose that back drag foot. So little like public service announcement, that is something I think we just like have to revisit in our game to the extent that it's still a rule at the older ages, another discussion, but it certainly should not be a rule at the younger ages because that's just ridiculous. We are sort of like teaching them to move slowly and to really just step off the rubber because that's really the only way that they can keep that back foot on the ground. But we're here to really just talk about that drag foot. For now, it is a rule that you have to essentially, keep a foot dragging. And so what we often see is pitchers who drag the entire side of the foot, like it's like stuck in mud. And we talk about that a lot. We talk about how to get on the side of the foot. A lot of times in debriefs here at S2 Breakthrough, when I point that out to someone, okay, your lack of rotation, and then here's why we see the drag foot do this, I see their eyes like open, like, forever we have been focused in all of my pitching lessons on trying to get that drag foot to turn. I've done so many drills and nothing works. And it's not that nothing works, it's that we haven't identified the root of the problem and started to really attack it from ground up. So I just want to show some examples today, just like we've done in some of these previous episodes in Series 5, of some videos of pitchers really not, being stuck on their drag foot. What does that even look like? What's the timing at which we would expect someone to get off the side of their drag foot? And then go into their 4D and show you like what's happening with the trunk, what's actually going on with the body that's making them get into that position. So let's turn over to my computer here as always. And this is the first picture. And this picture actually I'm going to show as an example of someone that does this pretty well. It doesn't mean her mechanics are totally optimal and everything is perfect, but for the sake of talking about the drag foot, we're going to look at a positive example to get this conversation started. So as this pitcher gets through, what we're going to see as she gets to the top of her arm circle is at the top of the arm circle, typically when timing is appropriate in the motion, that the foot is still off the ground. And then just after the top of the arm circle, this like X position, this is often what we talk about, like good trunk arm timing. Watch the drag foot. I'm going to reverse that for a second, and you'll see she's on the side of her foot as we would expect because she has to anchor with the back side of the body. And then as she starts to reverse and rotation starts to come into play, basically the pelvis is going to start rotating back toward the target. And an indicator to our eye as we're watching video that the pelvis is still engaged in her motion. Basically that she is holding good enough posture to still make a rotation back. So let me drag this in reverse one more time. We know that in pitching, there's an initial rotation here. To the degree that which the pelvis or the trunk as a whole is still in good enough posture to rotate back, that's really what we're going for here, because this is how we then send energy from ground as we plant into that stride foot, through the body, and to the arm, and ultimately the ball. So I really love this example, not only because this pitcher does this well, but because she's wearing stripes on her shorts. So if you watch this side of her shorts here, watch as her stride foot comes down, you'll start to see some rotation here. And so with that then, as the stripes turn, we see that she returns to like shoelaces almost finishing down, and then she'll drag through sort of like the top of her foot. But what I want to make really clear, I have seen so many things where people are doing drills where their feet are on the ground and they're like working on like femoral internal rotation. I've mentioned this in previous episodes, but the extent where we're taking like strength and conditioning concepts and like our pitching coaches are trying to like help you regain femoral internal rotation, I guess I would say to that is, one, did they even measure that you don't have femoral internal rotation or appropriate range of motion through femoral internal rotation? Have they measured if you have control over it? So likely that's probably not at the foundation. And two, in my mind, like, it's hard enough to really be good at your area. So every day I'm diving into data and how people are responding on the training floor and, seeing if we're seeing progression in pitching. There is no way that I could really be great and work to be great, I should say, in one area, and then also I'm the person who you should see to also learn whether or not you're rotating appropriately internally and externally through the femurs and the pelvis. Like that's another entity, which is why really S2 Breakthrough exists. It's like we've got the strength and conditioning side, the AT side, the assessment side, all of these that we're collaborating. And so I all automatically get a little bit like, I push away from these like videos. Of course they're always like, they've got awesome music to make everyone think like this is so awesome, but it's like pictures like rotating the femurs. I think like we have to really be cautious about that. I love the fact that it shows us we have to be paying attention to how the body's moving, but it kind of ends there for me. Like it's showing us that we're really looking at the pitching motion as a system and as a kinetic chain, and understanding that there's segments, ground up, concepts. That's great, but really that's not the way that you train rotation. So that's important. What we also know is that we don't actually come in contact with the ground on that backside unless we replant, which is illegal as of now in the rules. And so the femur does not lead the rotation. We have tons of data here that shows sort of when the femur is rotating, when the pelvis is rotating. The femur rotates just after the pelvis. It's the pelvis rotating while in the air as it's changing direction. So we don't want to do a drill where we have the back foot on the ground and we're just like turning the femur to try to get rotation. We don't have the ground at that phase of the motion, not on that right side if a right-handed pitcher, or the left side, so the dominant leg there, that drag foot. We don't have the ground unless we've replanted, which again is not in the rules right now. And it's not what's going first. It's not the femur turns and the pelvis goes. Like, it's clear as day in the data that we have. It's the pelvis before the femur. So that's really important to note here. So what we're talking about of whether or not the drag foot goes from the side of its foot and then returns is whether or not posture has held up through the motion to, again, not only rotate once, like toward the dominant side, but is it still in good enough posture to come back? Or is something that we did between load and launch, did something bust up posture so much that we are not rotating well anymore, and now we're not seeing that piece come back? And that's huge. Like, at the end of the day, what top of arm circle down is how we're transferring the majority of our energy. And so everything we do leading up to that is about keeping positioning and timing in order to maximize that point on in the motion. So let's come back to the computer here. Now we're looking at this 4D analysis for this pitcher. And I just have her at top of arm circle just because, again, this is a pitcher who does this well. And I just want to point out, we're seeing her about 75 degrees of rotation at her max, which is in normal range. Her posture is pretty good. We're like two here. We're like close to 0 here in the chest. We have 7, so we're less than 10 degrees. So her posture is in pretty good positioning, which is why we see then that not only has she rotated here, but as she comes back, what we'll do is we'll follow. So let me get this graph going. And we'll follow this red graph to the extent that she gets to ball delivery. You'll see this graph look like this. So got to about 75 degrees from about, we'll say 0 point, essentially, give or take a few degrees, but about 75 degrees, all within normal. And right when you see this slope change, this is where the pelvis has stopped rotating. It's where essentially it's met hike, front side resistance. We're at this sort of like ball delivery point. There is no more rotation here coming from the pelvis. And so we really get back to about a halfway. So she was about 75. We would expect this 35 to 40, which is where she gets. And then you'll see any additional rotation here, which is after this slope change. It's just because there's some residual, like she's still gonna have some chest movement here. And I can show you that as I get this forward. You'll see post ball delivery again. I'm not saying this is optimal in every way. So she'll have a little bit of like sagittal plane collapse, very minimal, but a little bit here. We saw that in her video, and the chest is still rotating then. And so that will get pulled with it. But this sort of like change in slope right here that I'm using with my cursor, that is really like where we know the pelvis has ended. And that's what we would expect to see when the pelvis is continuing to rotate. And that is why we see the drag foot once we use the ground on the left side as a right-handed pitcher in this example. It now simultaneously, we've driven back. We see the foot go to like toe down or laces down. And again, I think the stripes on the shorts are really such a great way to see that rotation visually. This series of Redefine the Circle is sponsored by 4D Motion Sports, the most powerful, portable, and affordable motion capture system. 4D motion sensors are used by the world's top sports professionals, and it's incredibly exciting to now have them for softball hitting and pitching. At S2 Breakthrough, every one of our athletes begins with an assessment process, which includes a biomechanics analysis using 4D motion sensors. The data is collected and available to read within seconds. It provides us with key metrics such as trunk stability, trunk rotation, as well as the timing and sequencing between the trunk and the arm. This is critical data for athletes and coaches to fully understand a pitcher's story and appropriately identify the root inefficiencies in her motion. The ability to fully maximize pitching performance metrics starts with understanding biomechanics And there's not a more accessible and efficient way to quantify that story than through 4D motion sports. That's what we're talking about. Okay, now let's go to example A of some things that we see, an example that we see, I should say, that when we know it's not going, that the drag foot is not in the best position. So I'm gonna get this picture going through her motion, and here she is landing at stride foot contact. And unlike the picture that we first took a look at, you can see this picture is still gonna stay on the side of the foot. And then as I continue to get her through ball delivery, she is gonna stay there. So this picture is gonna be a pretty extreme example, which I'll talk about, why in just a bit. But what we're gonna see is that posture is gonna be so compromised, there's no rotation, that basically she is gonna throw without any rotation of the body really at all. It's really like a linear, like an anti-rotation. This is where we have so much stress on the arm to do everything on the motion. Typically, pitchers like this are really stuck throwing one spin direction because basically the arm is just not in position to do anything else. That's kind of another topic for another time. But this is what we're seeing. And this is like maybe something that this pitcher would have spent lots of time doing drills to fix her drag foot. So now let's look at her 4D to show why that will never work for her. When I'm getting her 4D going, I'm skipping some steps here because we've introed this concept in other episodes about this being the graph of the pelvis and this being the graph of the chest. Basically, we're looking at the three planes of motion with the trunk as a whole, and we're just breaking it up with pelvis and chest here. So I know I'm skipping through that pretty quickly, but at this point, I feel like we've kind of covered that in pretty good detail. So as I'm coming through, I can see right away there's some pelvic instability here. There's definitely a timing issue in her load. And then immediately, like before she gets out of load, she's going to get into hyperextension. And I can see right away, like this is how she's launching. She is going from not enough force in the ground, less than 20 degrees. We've talked about it really should be 40, 45. And instead, the way she's launching is really lifting that chest up. You can see it here clear as day in this avatar. So she is going to be, without anchoring to the ground and using a ground up approach, her approach to launch right away is going to be extreme extension. So she is going to be in major hyperextension through that lumbar spine. We see that here in the graph in this big dip in the green here. We're looking at chest. That's her strategy to really launch because she doesn't have ground up. And in addition, this picture is a little bit of like, I guess you could say like a double whammy. She's pushing almost 70 degrees of pelvic rotation by launch when usually we're looking at like 50 to 55. So maybe sometimes I see up to 60, but that's pushing it. So basically she's over rotating because of that loss of like being able to anchor to the ground, and she's in extension. This is a double whammy. And this is why essentially over rotation and loss of posture, what happens for her is that the entire motion gets stuck, really being like sideways at this point, which is obviously what we're looking at here. So I'm going to come back. I'm going to get her to her max rotation, 91. So if we're looking at 90 is like totally sideways, facing like this is she's obviously right-handed, so she's facing the third base side. She's going beyond 90 degrees. This is where that over rotation, the chest, 92, we just totally over rotated. We've lost control over that. We're in deep extension. And this is why she can't get back from here. So you can see it as I let the avatar keep going. Here she is over 90 degrees, and we only get back to like 68, or we'd expect to see it about 45, give or take a few degrees based on we'd expect this to be able to keep rotating up to that 45 degree point. And it cannot because there's no rotation in the motion. So what I really want to hammer home with this concept is like, we cannot do drag foot drills with her. The drag foot is stuck there because of everything that happened beforehand. Let's go back to her load where she wasn't able to actively put force into the ground and really anchor the hips in the sagittal plane to make sure she has stretch and tension from arch of the foot through the calf, hamstring, glute, all of these concepts we talk about what it means to put force into the ground. And so her strategy was to just lift up through the chest, create a loss of posture. Simultaneously, this pitcher also over rotated. So again, that's that like double whammy effect. So by the time she landed, she had all of it. She's over rotated, she's in extension, and she is just stuck there. So getting her unstuck out of that, getting that foot to start to rotate, which means that she's in decent enough posture that the pelvis will keep being an active player in her motion, requires us to work on all of the stuff in the early phase of that motion to start to clean that up. So stay away from the drag foot, stay away from like like things like trying to drag forward. It's not, like this is an anti-rotation type of motion. So the extreme would be if we try to get her to just be forward. It's like, no, that's still anti-rotation. So we want to really understand that like these concepts, the drills we're often doing about like taking away movement are usually driving, another extreme. That's also important to note. So that's that example. Let's come back to the computer here and look at another one. I'm going to start with the 4D right away. Like you can see here when I'm looking at the pelvis graph in green, I typically am looking at like a nice smooth bell curve. And instead here you can see it is like tons of instability. So much instability here in the pelvis. And so there's going to be no surprise here. Whenever I'm seeing something like this, and I obviously see like just to the eye, there's no way this is making it back to about half of the, whatever this, just say, or about 90 degrees, we're getting back to 45. It doesn't have to be 90 degrees, but it's getting about halfway to that point. We can see with our eye that's not happening. So basically what we're going to see in this motion is the pelvis is just never ever a part of the motion. This picture is launching. She is never in good posture. She is immediately just like flying into some, to like her max rotation. So it's not excessive rotation, but she's just flying to the max. There's no control over the pelvis. There's no hike. We see the pelvis essentially like it's never in good posture. The pelvis as if it doesn't exist in this motion. And so what you can see here is that it's really chest led. It's really chest dominant. So what I'm going to show you with this picture, what this graph is really showing us is that like momentum is really what's driving her load, like this rocking back and forth really aggressively, but she's lost total pelvic control through that, never gains it. And so therefore she's not in good enough posture by the time she gets to top of arm circle for that pelvis to even do anything. So at this point, as she's reaching the top, pelvis is really far behind her, and it's just going to get stuck where she is. Let's take a look at what this looks like in real life now in the video as she's getting moving. This video kind of cut out, but she has a lot of like rocking back and forth, what I mentioned of this like momentum based load rather than a tension based load. She's going to be here. She reached 54 degrees of rotation. What we also saw from a behind view is that the reason she was able even to get there is because she took this like cheat turn with this front foot. But basically beyond that, the pelvis is never actively engaged. The chest is leading everything. So I think when I go back to this, when I look at like her peak chest, yeah, she's under rotated 60 degrees. Usually we're looking at about 70 or more. So she's just under rotated in the chest. And that's because everything's just driving forward with the chest here. And by the time she lands, not only is the chest just in the lead the whole time, now the pelvis is stuck behind her, which would be a little bit easier to see from a behind view here. And so we're also going to see a very similar movement where she's going to try to generate all the rotation through her neck, through her chest. She's going to be stuck here on the side of this drag foot. Basically, like what we're seeing with this picture is that it's as if like waist down doesn't exist in her motion. There was never a contribution there. There was never a sense of like loading it, of unraveling it, of using the ground. It just was all like a reach with the chest. So while her posture wasn't like so crazy, I will often in the debrief session say to a pitcher like this, it's like the pelvis was never in the game. So by the time you land, then the chest is just ready to rip on through and like continue to lead, and the pelvis is not doing its job. So again, for this pitcher, then the fix would be if we're trying to make change and get her to rotate more. The one of the things that this coach came to us, the coach and player came to us, was like, she looks like she's working so hard, but that velo isn't really represented of like how much energy she seems to be giving in her motion. It's the velo doesn't match that. And this is why, because she's just not using, when we say like use your legs, that's a really generic term. Like use your legs how? Like, is it in the load? Is it like because we're not getting enough posterior load? Like what's happening when we say use your legs? But this, like that phrase almost fits this example. Like waist down, there's really no contribution. And she's just doing so much work with chest and neck and arms to like rip it through. And we're not getting lower body to contribute. We're not getting that rotation. So again, just like the last example, do not do drag foot drills. That's not it. It's not that she can regain control over the drag foot when she lands. It's because of what happened earlier in the motion. We have to attack stability in the motion, controlling the pelvis, understanding how to basically keep it in the system, keep it contributing to gaining posture early on in the motion. and get it in position where it not only can get involved with posture, but it can start to rotate. So that's what we're looking at here. And I just think these are clear as day as I'm looking back at my computer. Like, it's so obvious to see a pitcher who not only is on the side of their drag foot, but these last two examples, basically like there's no drag at all. Like, it's like they have an anchor behind them. I think this is just like, I'm going to scroll back to the picture that we had here first. We see this with our eye, clear as day, of like there's so much energy left on the table here. And it's important to know why. These were two different reasons or two different routes for these pitchers, but it's going to go back to something where the pelvis was not in position to keep rotating. Again, for this pitcher, it was like extension. And then for this pitcher, it was just so much momentum. The chest was just in the lead to pull her forward and do all the rotating for her. So they're in slightly different positions, you can see, and that's why. But they have the same concept on the side of the foot, and we really are limited in the amount of drag that we can achieve at all. Let's look at this third and final example. And what I think is different about this as I get this pitcher going is that you're going to see, I think you already can picture in your mind what her 4D graph is going to look like just by looking at what posture looks like here in launch. And then what we're going to see is that she's at stride foot contact. She's going to stay on the side of her foot. But unlike the other two pictures we showed, she will, through ball delivery, it's going to be a little bit more of like a, she's kind of dragging behind her essentially, but we see a drag. And so maybe to our eye in video, when it's not high speed, we don't really pick up on that. We see that she's dragging that foot. But what I want to note is that when rotation is involved with the pelvis, when the pelvis is actively rotating back to the target, which is how we're going to maximize how we're transferring energy out of the body and ultimately to the ball, that by the time the stride foot lands, we should see the foot get off of its side, and we're not seeing that. So yes, she drags, but we are still not seeing an indication here of rotation. So let's take a look at her graph. Okay, so here's what we're seeing. Tons of instability in the pelvis as I'm getting her through load. I mean, also a very momentum-based pitcher. Tons of like up and down, up and down. We don't even see a bell curve here, essentially. Here's her launch. This is the top of her backswing. We are at 16 degrees. Like, there is no load whatsoever. There's no concept. I think she's a good hybrid example of these two pitchers because she has no concept. She's like example 2, very much about momentum, isn't really using the pelvis to load, to anchor into the ground, to create tension, to load the posterior side, all of those concepts. And in addition, she's going to have a strategy like pitcher number 1, where her main launch strategy is going to be hyperextension. So that's what we're seeing. You can even see like it's so much hyperextension, almost the arm. The sensors have trouble like picking up the arm through the chest, but she's getting into extreme hyperextension here. We can see the pelvis flies in rotation. Again, a good combination of what we're seeing with both pitchers, with example 1 and example A. It's sort of a hybrid. And so now as I'm getting her to come through and she's getting into 93 degrees of rotation, 86, this is a ton of rotation. What happens is because she had so much of a posture lost here, what she does is she manages essentially to have a strategy for a variety of reasons where she gets really sagittal plane dominant. So she just rips that chest forward. You can see it in the avatar. You can see like the pelvis or the hips are behind her, which is this big spike. The chest is really going to collapse forward. So what we do see in this graph is the pelvis is returning, okay, a little over 90 degrees. And then as I get her into ball delivery, it is returning to about this 40, 45. But we can clearly see that that's not happening on its own just because of, one, what we saw with our eye in video, that it's staying on the side of the foot. We know that it's not coming from true rotation. We also know that these are pretty extreme deceleration strategies. And there are other graphs. I've only really focused in these episodes on pelvis and chest. There's other graphs that I would then go to really be able to put pieces together in the story. Here's an example of one where we're just looking at rotation. I'm going to get her to the top of the arm circle here. And what you're going to see is by the time she gets to the top of her arm circle, the peak in green here, which is going to be her chest and pelvis, is already leading. So that like forward lean that she has is how she's going to pull. It's why the pelvis is just essentially getting rotated as the chest is collapsing. And so there's no actual pelvis initiating movement is really what I'm trying to get at here. We can see that the green graph, again, other graphs and other data here that I can pull to be able to show that. But I want to kind of show that as two different examples as I go back to her video, that this is what we're looking for. At stride foot contact, has the foot rotated? And if the answer is no, then the pelvis is no longer in the game. Essentially, it's no longer a part of the system. It's no longer leading rotation. And so for this picture, it's just such a loss of posture here. But because of the positioning of the chest, she's able to pull the chest forward. Unlike, as I keep scrolling back, this picture who was not in that position. And so instead, she sort of like posts up a little bit more, and therefore that got stuck. So what we are looking for as an indicator of whether or not the pelvis is still holding its weight, it's still contributing, is this concept, that rotation. Pitchers who are not doing that, again, have a variety of things that we're seeing, whether or not they actually get some drag or not, whether they're stuck on the side of the foot and sort of pulling forward like with adductors, or the chest is collapsing. There's a variety of ways, but that's the piece we're actually looking at. And in summary, what I want to really shout from the hilltops here is that the drag foot is just telling us whether or not we still have rotation from the pelvis up. And in some of those first examples, whether or not we have rotation at all, as you can see in like example A, where it's very limited in rotation as a whole, whether or not we're simply getting it from just the chest or the chest is collapsing. We can see a lot in video, but hopefully after this, listening to things like this podcast, we also then can kind of visualize, whether we have access to it or not, the data that lies underneath of it that's really telling the story of what's going wrong and what's happening with these pitchers. That's going to wrap up today's episode, episode 3, focusing specifically on the drag foot. I think this is just such an interesting concept from the beginning of time, from years and years ago. I know that the drag foot has been something that we talk about so much, and I just think it's often misunderstood of what's it supposed to be doing, what's an indicator of, what's the timing in which we're looking for. So hopefully today's discussion really kind of cleared up some of those questions. As always, I'm always open to hearing some additional questions from you or some feedback. Feel free to email, reach out at any point. Between today and the next episode, as always, keep pressing on to redefine the circle. Thank you, as always, for tuning in. I'll catch you next week. Thanks for listening to today's episode. I'd love to connect and hear your feedback. You can contact me directly at ashley@s2breakthrough.com. If you're listening, you can leave us a review, or if you're watching, go ahead and leave a comment below. Also, be sure to follow S2 Breakthrough on all of our social media channels and subscribe to Stream S2 to find all things player development. Until next time, quest on.